fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Lucille Butterworth went missing in Tasmania in 1969, and Australians were shocked to learn decades later that someone confessed to her murder just 7 years after her disappearance. Confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and poor police procedure so damaged this case that even a confession was not enough to close it. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines and our last 12 Days of Crimelines episode. If my voice sounds a little thin, I am just a little sick, but not bad enough to not record. I've definitely sounded worse over the years. This episode is the end of the 12 Days of Crimelines, which started off with the goal to cover 12 missing persons cases in December. But due to scheduling, my poor time management skills, some episodes getting longer than I anticipated, and some cases involving multiple missing people, we will have actually covered 18 missing persons, but it took me 2 months. We are closing this out with a case that is a little older than the others I've talked about, and it definitely piqued my interest when I started reading about it. The inquest in this case, which was not held until 2015, gave a very good retrospective on the investigation as a whole. The inquest report, which was released in 2016, and the reporting from the Australian Broadcasting Company were my main sources. This case was suggested by a listener who has written about this case on Reddit, and you can find her there under the handle Maybe Next Time, so thank you for sending this over. This is the first time in a decade of writing for and producing a number of true crime podcasts that I have ever covered a case out of Tasmania, which is the smallest state in Australia. During the time frame we're talking about, the late 1960s, there were about 385,000 people living on the island, and a large percentage of them were living in and around the capital city of Hobart. And we are talking about 20-year-old Lucille Gay Butterworth, who was born in Hobart in March of 1949 to Bruce and Winifred. In 1969, she was living across the Tasman Bridge from Hobart in a suburb, and she had to cross that bridge every day to get to and from work. She was a full-time typist at 7HO Radio and a part-time model. Lucille and her boyfriend John had been dating for about 2 years, and they were talking about getting married. Some reporting refers to them as being, quote, secretly engaged, but this wasn't exactly a covert engagement. It was more like they were in the stage between deciding to get married and even picking out rings, but not having yet announced the engagement. But it was perfectly clear to everyone around them that marriage was where they were headed. Like most outgoing 20-year-olds, Lucille's calendar was very full and maybe even a little overextended. She had work, of course, and she was close to her family, and she also had a lot of friends. So something was always going on. One thing she pretty much always had was on most Monday evenings, she and her boyfriend John had a meeting in New Norfolk, which is where John lived. And I am pronouncing New Norfolk that way because the majority of the videos I watched said it like Norfolk rather than like how we say in Virginia, we say Norfolk, Virginia. So apologies if I say it the way I'm used to saying it, like Norfolk, Virginia. But also apologies if YouTube has led me astray and I'm saying Norfolk for no reason. Anyway, this meeting was part of them supporting their friend who was in the Miss Tasmania competition. there was a fundraising aspect to it, and they were helping plan fundraising opportunities for a charity that set up and funded schools for children with intellectual disabilities. So on Monday morning, August 25th, 1969, Lucille went to work as usual. She left home around 8:40 and drove her car to where her aunt worked. Lucille would often park the car there and then walk the short distance to work. And on this particular day, on her lunch break, she went to see her aunt. She asked if she could leave the car there while she went to that Monday evening meeting that she had. The meeting was about a 30-minute drive in the opposite direction of Lucille's home, and her car was not exactly in the best shape. Her mom worried about her breaking down on longer drives than just her daily commute, and I'm sure that concern went double after dark. It wasn't the first time Lucille asked to leave her car with her aunt under these circumstances, and then she would either get a ride to the meeting or take the bus, so her aunt, of course, said yes. Lucille went back to work, and then she left with her coworker Kay at around 5:25. Kay had previously driven Lucille to the bus stop on Monday evenings, and that was the plan this night as well. There was a bus stop closer to their work, but if Lucille got a ride as far as Kay's house, which was in Claremont, she could save 20 cents on the bus fare because she was just that much closer to her destination. Kay had a quick errand to run right after work, and Lucille was worried about missing the bus, so they left about 5 minutes early, just hoping to avoid any issues. It was about 5:45 by the time they got to the bus stop. Kay let Lucille know that if she realized that the bus had already come and gone, she could just go to her house, and then Kay would drive her out to New Norfolk. Lucille said the bus would probably be there in a few minutes, so Kay headed home. Lucille never came over to her house, so she assumed she caught the bus without issue. But over in New Norfolk, Lucille's boyfriend John was wondering what was going on. He worked at his family's grocery store until they closed at 5:30. Add in cleanup and shutting things down, that would have taken at least 15 more minutes, but then he stayed even longer waiting on Lucille. The bus stop was pretty much across the street from the store, so he could see when she got off the bus, and she never did. John waited there until around 6:45. He figured maybe Lucille got a ride with someone rather than taking the bus, so he went home to eat dinner, which was a pretty short journey because he and his father lived in the apartment above the store. After eating, John got ready for the meeting and headed out, getting there right before 7:30. The meeting lasted until around 9:30, but Lucille never made it. After the meeting, John went home, and around 10 p.m. he tried to call Lucille. It was on the later side, so when no one answered, it was probably because they were asleep. He wasn't too worried at this point because this actually wasn't the first time that Lucille just didn't show up as expected. It had happened one time before this, and it was because Lucille was sick. However, John didn't find that out until the next morning when he called her at work. This was a time period not just before cell phones, but even before answering machines. So you really had to catch people near their phone or not at all. So with that in mind, John got up in the morning, he went to work, and he called Lucille at the radio station just after 9 a.m. to see how she was doing. Her coworker who answered the phone said Lucille hadn't come in that morning, but she also had not called out sick. They hadn't heard from her. So John called Lucille's mother, Winifred, and told her that Lucille hadn't made it out to him the night before, and she didn't make it to work. Winifred then called Lucille's father, Bruce, at work to let him know that they didn't know where Lucille was. He went straight home, and they called the Hobart Police. The police took down some information over the phone and then asked them to bring in a photograph of Lucille. After Bruce did that, he went to the radio station to see if anyone knew what happened after Lucille left work. He talked to Kay, who told him about the ride to the bus stop, So Bruce went right out there and began walking around to see if there was anything he noticed. He did a physical search in the area and a knock and talk with the open businesses around the bus stop, and none of them said they had seen Lucille. The early investigation was mostly Bruce, along with dozens of family members and friends, conducting their own searches. And that's because the police initially believed that Lucille had just taken off on her own. Thankfully, they did take general statements from people, so we do have some witnesses who saw the information in the newspaper about Lucille and contacted the police. We will talk about them in a minute, but other than that, the police did not do much in-depth investigation, to the family's surprise. There were a lot of reasons to believe Lucille didn't just take off. For one, her mother went into her room and looked through all her stuff. The only things missing were her orange work uniform, her black leather coat with fur trim, black shoes, her watch, a ring that she wore most days, and her purse. It also looked like a few overnight items had been taken, which was in line with her plan to stay with John after the meeting. Other than that, Lucille left all of her clothing behind, her car, which was still parked out by her aunt, her money, everything. It was all still there. The police did put her information out to the media to see if they could get some leads on where she went, and they also sent this information through Australia. The odds were that if she left the area, she may have left the island completely and could be elsewhere in the country. And this brought in some sightings, but none of them panned out. One issue with any sighting of Lucille that was based on the photo that was in the newspaper was that photograph showed her hair in a very different style than it was when she went missing. Days before her disappearance, Lucille had her hair cut into a bob and then highlighted, so it was both shorter and lighter than it looked in that picture. Her hairdresser even called the police to tell them this, thinking that maybe they could update the written description, even if they didn't have an updated photograph. But he said they never got back with him to ask more about it. And the information about her hair was not in any of the older reporting that I could find on newspapers.com. Lucille's family strongly disagreed with the police assertion that she had just up and left. They believed that someone would have heard from her. Feeling left to figure it out on their own, they did ask for help from Dutch psychic Gerard Quasset, who had just 3 years before made headlines in Australia for consulting with the Beaumont family about their 3 missing children. It was interesting to see Quasset's name come up at newspapers.com in the original reporting on this case, because one of his more well-known cases, one that he didn't solve, was Jeanette Tate, and I almost covered that disappearance for this 12 Days of Crimelines. It was reported that Quasset said he would help the family, but I have not been able to find a follow-up on that. In other cases, though, Quasset's help has been defined as vague and at times non-factual. If he consulted in this case, I believe that would be true of this one as well. Lucille's brother did say many years later that they were in touch with multiple psychics, many of whom contacted the family themselves, and at least one of them did much more harm than good, upsetting them with what he called an Academy Award-winning performance, but it's not clear if this psychic was Quasset or someone else. The family was fielding tips not just from psychics, they would also get letters and calls that would come directly to them. None of them ever led anywhere, and one particularly awful one was sent to Lucille's boyfriend, John. It gave him a pretty specific location of where Lucille's body could be found, and it said he needed to go to the old golf links at New Norfolk and look around for a mound near the river. He went out there with some others to check it out, and they did find a mound near the river. So they started digging with their bare hands, and they found the buried body of a ram. It seems like the police didn't start agreeing with the family that something bad had happened until February or March of 1970, so 6 or 7 months after Lucille disappeared, and no one had heard from her. That is when they did a new round of interviews, ones that were much more in-depth than before. So some of the information we have came right after she disappeared, but then a lot of the little details didn't get filled in until the later interviews, simply because people weren't asked for those details until then. But thankfully, most of the eyewitnesses were talked to very early on, within days of Lucille's disappearance and before their memory of a random Monday in August faded. Even though Claremont wasn't exactly a bustling city at that point, we have these witnesses because of the time of day. People were ending their workday and heading home, so they were out and about. 5 separate people, not related to each other, saw Lucille at the bus stop that afternoon, and we can be pretty sure the person they saw was Lucille because of her clothing. They all more or less described her as wearing orange with a black leather coat over it with fur trim, and some noticed she was carrying an orange bag that held her overnight stuff and her black purse. Black and orange are a striking combination, particularly when the person dressed that way is also really good looking like Lucille was. People noticed her. 2 of the witnesses didn't see much that was noteworthy except to confirm that Lucille was in fact standing at the bus stop around 6 p.m. that evening. They both described her clothing to the T, even the fact that she was carrying 2 bags and that her hair was light, short, and swept back. And those are details they would not have gotten from the newspaper because the hairstyle was new and the picture in the paper was of her longer, darker hair.
In 1965, rural Minnesota, a teenage night shift gas station attendant was shot dead. His killer was caught, sentenced to 40 years, and the story should have ended there, but what followed left everyone shaking their heads. I'm James Wallner with Dakota Spotlight. In my new season, Meanwhile in Mankato, Lies, Silence, and Murder in Minnesota, I uncover how a con man charmed and deceived his way through a life of crime while the state of Minnesota looked on. Check out Dakota Spotlight. You'll be shaking your head in disbelief, too.
The next 2 witnesses saw things that may give us more of a clue as to what happened next. A man named Gordon was driving home from work, and he was in the vicinity of the bus stop at around 5:55. Traffic was relatively heavy, so he was driving slowly, and as he approached the bus stop, he saw a young woman take a couple steps towards the curb and lean over like she was looking into his car to see who was driving. Leaning forward to see who was driving could mean she was waiting on a ride, and the person drove a similar car, a white sedan, but there has been no evidence she called anyone for a ride. There were 2 nearby payphones she could have used, but none of the witnesses saw her at the phone, and no one came forward to say that they had been called. It is possible she thought she knew the driver, and if she did, maybe she could have asked for a ride, and that's why she was looking in. But Gordon didn't know Lucille, and Lucille didn't know him, so he drove on. The 4th witness, Anthony, also saw Lucille at the bus stop right around 6. He was in the area to pick his wife up from work, so he pulled over and parked to wait for her for about 10 minutes. So he didn't just see Lucille in passing like everyone else did, and therefore he had the most detailed information. Anthony noticed that Lucille kept looking up the street, almost like she was anxious, or maybe she was impatient. His impression was that maybe she missed the bus. Because traffic was slow, like Gordon said, Anthony said a number of cars slowed down and even stopped around the area of the bus stop. He did say one in particular stood out, a turquoise early model Holden. He described it as a, quote, bomb, which, according to my Australian to American translator Stephen, means that it was a junker. Specifically, he said it had damage to the driver's side door. A couple minutes after the Holden stopped, Anthony's wife came out and they left. At that time, the Holden was not there anymore, and Anthony was pretty sure, but not 100% certain, that Lucille also wasn't there anymore. But he did not see her get into a car. These are just the snapshots of things he noticed, and he was very mindful, it seems, in his statement, not to draw lines between these things, and he stuck just to what he actually saw. The fifth witness that day did not make a statement for many, many years after the disappearance, but her account has still been deemed credible. A woman named Judith came forward decades later, saying that she saw Lucille on the day she disappeared, back when Judith was just 9 years old. Her family ran the post office near the bus stop, and they lived next door. She said she was outside playing on the porch when she noticed Lucille. She said she saw Lucille waving to a vehicle as it pulled away, and that very likely was Kay dropping her off. Judith said that as Lucille passed by her walking to the bus stop, she said hi, and then Lucille said hi back. Judith watched her a bit, and she said Lucille spoke to someone in a white car. That is the same color car that Gordon was driving, which was the car that Lucille stepped forward and peered into. So it is possible that Judith only saw what looked like Lucille speaking to the driver. And that is a little detail that I don't imagine Judith got from the reporting on the case, because Gordon's early police statement wasn't reported on at that time as far as I can tell. So that does lend some credibility to her overall recollection. It might seem strange that a 9-year-old remembered all of this decades later, but something I think is important to note that was mentioned in the 2016 Inquest report was that the police did knock on her family's door in the days after Lucille disappeared when they were looking for witnesses. They asked Judith's mother if she saw anything, which she hadn't, and Judith told her mom what she saw. Her mother told her she didn't see anything, either because she didn't want her daughter involved in a police investigation or because she didn't think her daughter saw what she said she saw. Either way, Judith did tell this story early on and would have a reason to remember it decades later. Something else that strikes me about Judith's statement when we talk about reliability is that she didn't try to zhuzh it up. She said things like she had the impression that Lucille was carrying something, but she couldn't actually remember her carrying anything. She seemed to know the line between what she actually remembered and what was a little fuzzy, and she didn't try to fill in the blanks of what Lucille was wearing or cars that came by or anything like that. Her memory really contains the things a 9-year-old girl would notice about an attractive, stylish young woman she's covertly watching. The last Judith saw of Lucille was when Lucille started to walk off heading north. A bus did arrive at the bus stop shortly after this, but Judith did not remember seeing Lucille get on it. So those were the people who saw Lucille that day. Let's talk about the 2 people who didn't see her, and those were the bus drivers. There were actually 2 buses that Lucille could have gotten on. One usually came at 5:35, but it was running late that day because of a mechanical problem. It didn't make it to the bus stop until 6:10. And when it finally got there, no one was at the stop. The other bus driver arrived around 5:50 as usual. He stopped because someone else was getting off the bus, but he said no one got on. So we do have a little contradiction in the timeline. The bus driver who stopped at 5:50 did not see Lucille at the bus stop, but Kay said she dropped her off around 5:45. We also have those other witnesses who saw Lucille between about 5:50 and 6:05 at the bus stop. So I have to wonder if maybe the bus actually got to the stop a few minutes before 5:50, And maybe Kay dropped Lucille off a few minutes later than she remembered, so the truth was that Lucille did miss the bus, but just barely. She was not at the stop at 6:10 when the second bus, the one that was running very late, showed up. So what happened in those 5-ish minutes from when Lucille was last seen at the bus stop and the second bus arrived? It seems very likely, almost certain, that she got into a car. With the number of witnesses around, it seems hard to imagine that she was forcibly kidnapped and no one heard or saw a thing. It makes more sense that, thinking she missed the bus, Lucille took a ride willingly. But no one, or at least no one who knew her, thought it was probable she would have gotten in the car with a complete stranger. Lucille was too cautious for that, plus it was unnecessary. Her coworker Kay already offered to drive her if she missed the bus, so she just had to walk over to Kay's house, which was maybe a 5-minute walk from the bus stop. So that leaves us with the theory that Lucille got into the car of someone she knew. And from there, she disappeared, and that fueled some suspicion among her friend group. So let's go ahead and get the most obvious one out of the way, her boyfriend John. He definitely would have been someone she would have gotten into a car with. What if she did use the payphone to call him and ask him to come get her? It seems possible on the surface, but the timeline just doesn't work. He was with coworkers at the store until at least 5:45. He then went up an hour later to his apartment to eat dinner with his dad, and then he made it to the meeting that evening as planned. If John was involved, he had at most 1 hour. Driving out to the bus stop and back to his house would have taken at least 40 to 45 minutes. But as we know, traffic was a bit heavy at that time, so probably longer. That would give him less than 15 minutes to do whatever was done to make Lucille disappear, and he managed to do it without anyone seeing him leave the store or arrive at the bus stop. John was looked into and ruled out during every stage of the investigation and all subsequent reinvestigations. In 2015, John told the media he lost his soulmate when Lucille disappeared, and it's very clear he carried that grief for the rest of his life. Over the years, persons of interest would be developed, sometimes through investigation, but more often through direct tips. They were all investigated and mostly ruled out. One such tip noted in the Inquest report was a man who didn't even live in Australia in 1969. Someone called in a tip that this man might be involved in a disappearance that occurred 3 or 4 years before he was even in the country. It was like that. Persons of interest would be identified and largely ruled out, and in the end, and by end I mean the 2015 inquest, there were 4 main suspects left, 2 of whom, if they were involved, worked together. So let's go ahead and talk about them first, not because they were the earliest suspects developed, but because they are the least likely answer to this mystery. In November of 1986, a man named Lance went to the Perth police and confessed that he helped a rugby player named Bobby dispose of a body in Tasmania. Lance's story, to summarize it as quickly as I can, was that sometime in the mid-1960s, he and Bobby picked up a young woman from a bus stop and drove to somewhere in Hobart. He left Bobby and this woman in the car alone for about 10 minutes. And when he came back, the woman was in the back seat, covered with a blanket. Lance said Bobby told him he was an accessory to anything that happened after that point, and he asked Lance to help bury the body and to bury it deep. Lance did as requested, and he told the police in 1986 where they could find the body in Tasmania. They searched and dug, but found nothing. After confessing, Lance was arrested and extradited to Tasmania, but the charge was adjourned a month later. An adjournment is different from a dismissal. An adjournment puts a pause on the proceedings for a period of time, and this one was indefinite. They were not going to be ready to prosecute this based on Lance's story anytime soon, so he was granted bail and left the area. In looking at who the victim could be during this investigation into Lance's claims, of course Lucille's name came up. Lance initially put the time frame as a little too early for that. He said 1963 to about 1968, but maybe he was off by a year. Lance's story did get bolstered by a 1987 declaration to the police made by a local businessman and politician named Donald who lived in Kingston, which was the same area where Lance said he buried the body. Donald said that in the mid-1970s, he dug up a human ribcage, but he did not alert the authorities to this discovery. Instead, he reburied the bones himself. The police did act on this information and searched the area where he said he reburied the ribcage, but nothing was found. Over the years, Lance's story would not stay consistent. In 1989, Lance spoke with a journalist and gave a different location as to where he left the body. This time he said he took it out to Port Davey by boat, which was one of the only ways you can get out there. Port Davey is a remote area that has no road access. Then in 2011, Lance told a different journalist that they buried the body back at the original location, but then he said in 2015 at the inquest that the 2011 journalist told him what to say because he was trying to generate buzz over a book he was writing. Another change Lance made over the years was saying that maybe they didn't pick her up at a bus stop, but rather a hotel. And then at the 2015 inquest, he said the incident happened during the time the Tasman Bridge was being built. Wikipedia tells me that the bridge was finished in late 1964. That is nearly 5 years before Lucille went missing. As for the ribcage found and then reburied in the area, a reinvestigation of the case found the backhoe operator who said he was with Donald on the day the discovery was made. And he said they didn't report it to the police because the bones weren't human. He said they were sheep bones, and that's why they simply reburied them, which makes a lot more sense than reburying human remains. So we are just going to cross Lance and Bobby off the list. Whatever did or did not happen between them and a young woman in the 1960s does not appear to be related to Lucille's case. And should Lance's story or any piece of it be true and accurate, I do hope they figure out what happened for the sake of that young woman's family. But let's go ahead and move on to the two suspects that I do think we can say were truly official suspects, not just persons of interest or suspicious people. The first was a man named John Lonergan, and he was an early suspect because of accusations against him from before Lucille's disappearance. In 1969, John was 27 years old and he lived in New Norfolk with his wife and their 8-year-old daughter. He worked in law enforcement briefly, becoming a constable in January of 1956 and resigning just over 2 years later. A few months after his resignation, in June of 1958, he was charged with assault of an indecent nature against an older teen girl, but the charges were dropped. After that was legally done with, he did apply to join the police force, rejoin, but his application was rejected. And rightfully so, as this would not be the last accusation against him, and it appears he was a serial sexual offender. We know a large percentage of rapes go unreported now, and research has shown it was even worse in the 1950s and 60s, so we only know about the crimes where he was formally accused. There could be any number of other victims. In July of 1962, John attempted to rape a young woman, and in December of that same year, he did rape a woman and was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in jail. In April of 1963, while he was free, pending his appeal on the previous rape, he indecently assaulted someone else. That added another 18 months to his prison sentence. He was released in July of 1966, and we have the next accusation against him in May of 1969, 3 months before Lucille disappeared. John offered a 26-year-old ballet teacher a ride, and he gave her the alias Peter Evans. After she was in his car, he threatened her with a hammer and attempted to rape her. She was able to get away, and though she reported the attack to the police, he was never charged because the victim did not want to go through the court process for obvious reasons. It's very hard to relive a trauma. Those attacks all happened before Lucille went missing, so when the police checked for sex offenders in the area, of course the name John Lonergan popped up. And when they tried to look into his alibi, they realized he did not have one. He should have had one. John worked second shift at the mill, so on the Monday Lucille disappeared, he should have been at work on his 4 to 11 shift. But he never showed up. It sounds like he was not on the schedule again until Saturday because that's when he told his supervisor that he needed to use sick leave for his Monday absence. He claimed he had been painting and tossed some rags in the fireplace, which caused the fire to flare. He was too close and ended up with burns on his face and one of his arms, which were visible injuries. He wasn't making it up, or at least not the burns. The suspicion is he may have been making up what he was burning. And John didn't have proof of how he got the burns because his wife and daughter weren't home at the time. The Saturday before, he dropped them off to stay with family until Wednesday when he picked them back up. When his wife asked him about the burns, he told a similar story about the fire, but she initially said she was not aware he had been painting. She said there was no damage to the house when she got home, but his pajamas were missing, and he said it's because he was wearing them at the time of the fire incident and they had been singed. John's wife eventually left him, and she told the police she believed he was capable of having killed Lucille Butterworth. She seemed to think he did do it, and she said he would get agitated anytime Lucille's name came up, which it did because it was a high-profile case in their area. John left Tasmania a few months after the disappearance in December of 1969, so he was tracked down and interviewed in June of 1970. Over the 6-hour-long interview with the police, he denied any involvement in Lucille's disappearance, and he told the police that he got the burns because a log rolled out of the fire while he was painting, and he was trying to put it back in the fireplace when it popped and he got burned. As for what he was doing at the time Lucille went missing, John told the police that he went to a local bar, had a few drinks, and then went home. He said it was right around 6 p.m., and he did give names of 2 people he was with at the bar. But by the time the police followed up on this, which was months later, their memories were understandably fuzzy. One of them did remember having drinks with John someday in the latter part of 1969, and it was a time when John had bandages to his face, so it could have been when he got burned, but he didn't know what day that was. The house John lived in at the time of the disappearance was searched, and of course they were interested in the contents of a fire pit that was on the property. Metal does not burn well, and there were a few potentially interesting things found, like a hair slide, the back of a makeup compact, and a lipstick tube. These were the types of things Lucille may have had in her purse or her overnight bag. But the inquest report noted that there was nothing in the police files that indicated that anything happened with these items other than being taken into evidence. Nothing says they showed them to John Lonergan's ex-wife to see if they were hers, or to Lucille's mother to see if maybe they were Lucille's. And by 2015, when the inquest was held, the items had been lost. During a reinvestigation that happened around 2011, John Lonergan was found again, living in another part of Australia, but he died before he could be re-interviewed. His ex-wife was interviewed, and over the years, she did add more details to her story, details that made him look more guilty, but nothing that could be verified at that point. There were things like remembering a weird smell coming from part of the house, but whatever that smell was gone by the time the police searched. John's ex-wife was not the only person who was convinced he did it. One of the original lead investigators, Detective Inspector Canning, was so sold on John Lonergan as the perpetrator that he has been accused in more recent times of tunnel vision so extreme that he purposely ignored a confession. By the time this information came out, this former detective inspector was suffering dementia, and then he died shortly after, so he was unable to defend himself against any of these accusations. But let's go ahead and get into the details on this other suspect, Jeffrey Hunt, who may have confessed. He got on the radar in Lucille's case the same way John Lonergan did, by committing a similar crime. But he did it after Lucille went missing. In 1976, Jeffrey Hunt called a car dealership saying he was interested in buying a car. He made arrangements to meet the saleswoman, Susan Knight, to see the car and take it for a test drive. According to Jeffrey's version of events, as they were driving, Susan told him that she was worried they had a flat tire due to a thumping noise coming from the back. He pulled over, and out of nowhere, he said he had the sudden urge to attack her. She managed to run off, so he chased her down. He admitted he raped her, and then he bashed her in the head. He covered her body with sticks and rocks that were nearby and drove the car back to where his car was parked, and then he went home. Jeffrey was arrested on his way to work just 2 days later and brought in for questioning. They had identified him as a suspect early on because he was seen in the area, and he stood out because he had albinism. His skin was very pale, and his hair, even though he was in his mid to late 20s, was nearly white. Jeffrey confessed pretty quickly to this crime, and then they asked him about another crime in the area, Lucille Butterworth's disappearance. Jeffrey lived in New Norfolk at the time, and he knew Lucille's boyfriend's family. There is reliable evidence that he even worked in their grocery store at various points. According to the official police record, Jeffrey had little to offer in regards to Lucille's disappearance, but according to two of the detectives on the case, he made a full confession. Because the official stance was that he said nothing more happened, at least not in Lucille's case. In the case of Susan Knight, he was sentenced to life in prison, and there was some resentencing along the way, but in the end, he was paroled in June of 2000 after 24 years in prison. He has since been living in Australia under a new name. The fact that two detectives said Jeffrey Hunt confessed was known to investigators before the 2015 inquest, but that is when the general public learned about it because both of these detectives who took the confession testified as to their memory of what he said. According to them, Jeffrey said he saw Lucille at the bus stop on his way home from work that day. One of the routes he could have taken from work to his home would have taken him right near the bus stop at the exact right time. Jeffrey knew Lucille not well, but she was the girlfriend of someone he grew up with, so he knew her at least by sight. And she knew him about the same. Jeffrey would years later deny they knew each other at all, but there are just too many other witnesses and common sense to say they, at the very least, knew of each other. According to the detectives, back in 1976, Jeffrey said that he figured Lucille was heading to New Norfolk and he decided to pull over and offer her a ride, which she accepted. And this is one reason some would put Jeffrey ahead on the suspect list. It is believed Lucille got into a vehicle willingly, and she would have hesitated to take a ride with a stranger, like John Lonergan. But that doesn't mean she would have only taken a ride from a close friend. Maybe an acquaintance going in the right direction after she was worried she missed her bus. That would have been a tempting ride to accept. And Jeffrey said, according to those detectives, that's exactly what happened. Lucille accepted the ride, and as he drove, they just made small talk. About 10 minutes or so went by when Lucille complained of a foot cramp. Jeffrey said he pulled over, told her to come over to him, and then he grabbed her. He tried to kiss her as she struggled against him, and then he said he strangled her until she was dead. Jeffrey said he immediately took her body out of the car and carried it to the River Derwent, which is a significant body of water. This is not a creek. The detectives who took this confession, if we remember, were actually working on a different case, the murder of Susan Knight, so that was their priority. What they did was pass on the information about the confession to the detective on Lucille's case, Detective Inspector Canning. And both of the detectives told the inquest that they were told by Canning they were wrong. Jeffrey Hunt didn't do it. So the detectives went back to Jeffrey and asked him again about Lucille. And he confessed, according to them, a second time. And he said he would even show them where he left her body. With confirmation from this man that he was guilty, they went back to Canning, and again, he told them they were on the wrong track. So Jeffrey Hunt went to prison for murdering Susan Knight, and Lucille's case stayed unsolved as the lead investigator continued to believe John Lonergan was guilty. At the 2015 inquest and during earlier reinvestigations, Jeffrey Hunt was questioned, and he denied everything, and I mean everything. Not just denying that he killed Lucille or that he confessed, he claimed he didn't really remember the police asking him much about it at all. He also denied that he knew her boyfriend, knew her boyfriend's family. In fact, he claimed not only did he never work for the family, he never even stepped foot into their grocery store, even though it was a 1 to 2 minute walk from his front door. The inquest heard from 3 witnesses other than Lucille's boyfriend that Jeffrey did occasionally work in the grocery store doing odd jobs like unloading groceries and making deliveries. They had other witnesses who said Lucille had referred to Jeffrey in conversations with other people, making his denial that he didn't know anyone just nonsensical, and honestly, it made him look more guilty rather than less, because why lie about these details if they were otherwise innocuous? Lucille's sister-in-law testified about one time Lucille mentioned Jeffrey Hunt, and it was a story about him looking over the fence at her sunbathing while she was visiting John. The grocery store was on the ground floor and their apartment was above it, but they did have the back of the grocery store yard fenced in. She was bringing up him looking over the fence at her because she found it creepy enough to mention it. So Jeffrey was asked about this in the inquest, and according to the inquest report, his denials of the incident were odd. Instead of just saying he didn't do it, he was focused on the logistical setup, talking about the fence height making having peered over impossible. So Jeffrey was on the one hand saying he never even stepped foot into the grocery store, but then 45 plus years later, he could remember the height of the fence and whether or not he could see over it. As for Jeffrey's alibi, he said that yes, he did get out of work at 5:30, and if he drove home, it would put him in the area of the bus stop at the right time, but he said he didn't drive to work. He took the bus to and from work because he didn't have a driver's license in August of 1969, let alone access to a car. But it turned out both of those things were not true, and the investigators proved it. First, they proved he got his driver's license a year before in 1968. So Jeffrey conceded this point, but then he said it didn't change that he didn't have access to a car. But then the investigators found out that he did, In April of 1969, his father bought an old car for the family to use. His father didn't have a driver's license, so Jeffrey was the one who drove the car, even taking the family out of town to a wedding. But Jeffrey still insisted he did not use the car to get to and from work, except the inquest heard his coworkers directly contradict this. They said he did drive. He drove a blue FB Holden to work every day. And that car matched the description of the one seen by a witness at the bus stop that day, including that it had body damage to it. The inquest also heard from other witnesses, like 3 former inmates who served time with Jeffrey, who said that he talked about being in prison for one murder, but that he had committed another. Only the body in that case had never been found. The inquest really heard from so many witnesses that I summarized a lot of the points, and I hope I didn't leave out anything that would make the coroner's ruling feel like it came out of left field. But in his report, he found it was clear that Lucille was deceased, and he said he had 3 options as to what happened to her: suicide, death by accident or misadventure, or homicide. He said he accepted the interviews and testimony from friends, family, and even her doctor, who all said she wasn't depressed, she had no mental health concerns, she had no physical health concerns, she wasn't having financial problems or relationship issues. She never expressed suicidal ideation to anyone, and she never wrote about it in her diary. She loved her job, and so on. As for accident or misadventure, that didn't really make sense because Lucille was at a bus stop in a well-populated area. She wasn't camping or hiking or mountain climbing. Someone would have seen what happened and they would have found her body, so the coroner believed that Lucille was murdered, and he believed the confession as reported by the 2 detectives. Jeffrey Hunt, in his opinion, had killed Lucille Butterworth, and the police knew it back in 1976, but because of tunnel vision and a detective being married to his theory on the case, it went unsolved for another 40 years. After the inquest report was published, the Tasmania Police Commissioner apologized to the family for the inaction of the police at different stages of the case. And from there, everything was in the hands of Tasmania's Director of Public Prosecutions. And they found in 2017 that they would not be able to charge Jeffrey Hunt or anyone else for Lucille's murder. A lot of the information and testimony allowed in at the inquest would be inadmissible in a criminal court. And looking at what they had left, it just wasn't enough to take it to trial. The area of the river where Jeffrey's confession pointed to has been searched over the years, but tides change, water does a lot of damage to shorelines and to evidence, but the family has also conducted independent dive searches in the hopes of getting some answers. It felt like the case was so close to being resolved in 2016, but now, 10 years later, it's still open. Of course, both of Lucille's parents have passed away, and her brother Jim, who was a fierce advocate for her case, also died in 2019. And then her boyfriend John died in 2020, leaving her younger brother John to continue the search for answers. He recognizes that it will take a big lead to get this case resolved at this point. And maybe you're the person who holds that information, or given the demographic of my listeners, maybe it's your mom or your dad. But if you do know anything about the disappearance of Lucille Butterworth, you can contact the Tasmania Police at 131-444 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. These numbers will be in the show notes.